both learn something practical that will impact your daily work, as well as gain perspective on the broader picture of how AI is affecting business and society at large. Today and tomorrow, we have our general session content, followed by both business content and technical content. Within the business tracks, we will dive into both organizational change and applied AI, the former focused on enterprise-wide transformations, and the latter focused on specific use cases that every company can find helpful. Within the technical track, each piece of content is meant to highlight a different stage of an AI project, along with challenges teams face along the way. If you'd like to do some discussion over Zoom with your peers, join a town hall where you and the other event attendees can discuss relevant AI topics. Day one's town hall will be about whether or not we are already living in an AI simulation. And day two will be all about the biggest hashtag AI fails we've all had, stories of AI projects gone wrong. Otherwise, remember that you can ask the speakers questions and discuss ideas in real time during every talk by way of the chat box feature in Swap Card. Now, let's have a great time learning about AI. Now, for our first speaker, Dr. Joshua Meltzer, Senior Fellow at Brookings. Dr. Joshua Meltzer focuses his research on digital trade, emerging technologies, and AI. Meltzer leads the digital economy and trade project and co-leads the Forum for Cooperation on AI. He has testified before the US Congress, the US International Trade Commission, and the European Parliament. Without any further ado, please welcome Joshua to the virtual stage.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to provide a short presentation on artificial intelligence and the regulatory and geopolitical developments happening globally. I'm at the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC, one of the world's premier think tanks. I want to give a shout out at the beginning of this presentation to PolicyWare, which is an online platform for those interested in getting access to sort of cutting edge courses that cover some of the most recent developments around a whole range of technology issues, including artificial intelligence and digital trade. You can go there, you can register if you're interested and be available for the next course. I think that's going to be run next year, but these are hybrid online courses that include access to the experts that are being taught by some of the world's leading sort of practitioners and researchers on these topics. And if you want to get a continued update and meet other practitioners and build a network, this is definitely the place to do it. So I highly recommend that if that's of interest to you. So what I'm going to do is discuss the developing international environment for AI regulation and policy. What I want to do is start with AI principles. And many of you on this presentation will be familiar with the fact that there's been a lot of progress globally developing international AI principles around ethical and responsible AI. A lot of these build off the OECD principles on AI, which were adopted in May 2019. About 42 countries have now signed onto these principles, including the US, the EU, Japan, and other major economies. The G20 human-centered AI principles, which came out in 2020, drew heavily on the OECD principles. They were referred to more recently by the G7 in their meeting in France this year. And so there's a lot of momentum behind these principles as really kind of an orientating set of guidelines for moving towards how do you develop responsible and ethical AI. The US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which I'll discuss again later in the presentation, that met in Pittsburgh a couple of weeks ago, also discussed the OECD AI principles. And the US has given effect to these principles, at least in some domestic context, through various executive orders, which are sort of essentially requiring government agencies when developing and using AI to ensure that it is consistent with these AI ethical principles. Principles on AI ethics and responsibility are also being developed by industry. They're being developed by think tanks and academia, and there's considerable overlap amongst them. A lot of convergence, particularly around common approaches to the importance of accountability, privacy, fairness, transparency, and cybersecurity. But there are some differences, so ongoing work in aligning globally, particularly the world's democracies, around what is a consistent set of principles for responsible AI, remains very much a work in progress and still something to work on. But really the next step that governments around the world are thinking about is how do we move from AI principles to regulation, non-regulatory frameworks, but essentially give effect to them in our economies and our societies. So at least 60 countries globally now have adopted various AI policies. And this slide really highlights that there are a range of different approaches happening globally. I'm going to come back to the AI use cases point later in the presentation to explain what's happening there. What you see is that starting with sectoral approaches, a lot of the AI systems that are being developed, whether it's in autonomous vehicles, in the health sector, in the finance sector, have obviously sectoral applications, and there is a lot of sectoral regulation that already applies. So the question for a lot of governments is, to what extent does existing regulation, essentially, is it fit for purpose for the new challenges, risks, and opportunities that AI will present, and where is new regulation needed? So if you look at, for instance, the US FDA is assessing the need for new regulation for AI ML software as a device. When it comes to autonomous vehicles, 29 states in the US have enacted AV legislation, and governors have issued executive orders. And in some cases, this is not only about essentially requiring new regulation because AI poses different risks, but in fact, updating the regulation because it applies to a situation that is changing. So if you look at the Senate bill in the US Congress, some of the proposals there would exempt vehicles from requirements of having to have controls for human drivers, and would give the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration the power to exempt vehicle manufacturers from certain safety standards. So it's also about updating these regulations to make them relevant for an AI context. In a sectoral vein, you can look at what China has been doing on social media regulation, where their cybersecurity regulator announced draft rules that would require companies that use recommendation rhythms such as ByteDance and Alibaba to provide increased transparency on how their recommendation algorithms work, and provide opportunities for turning off the recommendation algorithm. So a sectoral approach to a specific AI issue there. Another approach which is happening globally is horizontal regulation, and the most prominent of this is the proposed EU AI Act, which divides AI into 4 categories of risk. For our purpose, the most important is what they call high-risk AI systems, and those that are deemed high risk then have to comply with a whole range of rules on data governance, documentation and record keeping, transparency, human oversight, robustness, accuracy, and security. And this applies as horizontal, it applies to all AI systems. High-risk systems includes those that would be used as safety components in products, machinery, toys, medical devices. But in addition, the AI Act defines certain standalone AI systems as high risk when they pose special risks to what they call established fundamental rights. There's a list of AI risks, what would constitute AI risk systems, and it's open-ended, so more can be added to it. The AI Act also bans some AI systems, such as facial recognition, likely to cause physical or psychological damage. The importance of the AI Act is that it has very broad jurisdiction, so it covers providers of AI systems in the EU, irrespective of where the provider is located. So you can have AI systems located within the EU, you can have the AI being developed in the US outside of the EU, but being used in the EU, and it would then mean that that AI system is subject to the jurisdiction of the AI Act. This is what is often referred to as the Brussels effect, where EU regulation has global implications. A key obligation is on providers to then conduct conformity assessment to ensure that the high-risk systems comply with the sets of rules that the legislation covers, and I discussed just before. But there are various challenges still that need to be discussed and addressed there, including how AI systems change or learn in the wild. And so the risk profile of an AI system ex ante may change as it gets used and learns further. And so there's a requirement about post-market monitoring as well in that system. Moving on now to what I would call a wait and see approach. Now, I don't want to suggest this is a do nothing approach, but it essentially is guided by the idea that AI is an early technology and governments should avoid rushing in to regulate and let the technology develop before assessing what regulation may be needed. Some of this is evident in the US Executive Order 13859, which gives guidance on sort of broad strategic objectives to further promote and protect American advancements in AI, with the essential sort of point here that it reinforces the point that regulation should protect and advance innovation and not stifle it. In Japan, there's a heavy use of what they call AI utilization guidelines, which is really their vehicle for trying to implement the OECD AI principles, and it focuses on non-binding guidance for industry rather than regulation. Another box there you'll see is industry self-regulation, and this is happening extensively, and you know a lot about this, where industry had developed internal processes to guide development of responsible AI. So for instance, if you look at Microsoft, they have an Office of Responsible AI, which oversees big picture implementation of their own AI principles. They've got the Ether Committee, which then feeds recommendations to senior leadership on responsible AI issues, technologies, and best practices. And they've got a responsible AI strategy in engineering initiative and engineering team. Google similarly has got their own AI principles and an internal process to assess and review AI systems to ensure that they comply with them. I want to move now quickly on to not standards. We'll talk about that shortly, but to the geopolitics in AI, because that's where standards certainly comes into it. A lot of AI technology is being discussed in international standards bodies, including the ISO, the IEC, the IEEE, and also being developed domestically. And so this is another area where AI standards that will be relevant for AI industry are being developed. These standards are ultimately voluntary, but often domestic regulation refers to the standards. Business-to-business contracting uses these standards, so they become enforceable and matter for businesses through these various channels. From the US perspective, certainly AI is very much now caught up in geopolitics as well, particularly with respect to China, where China, through its Made in 2025 plan, is aiming to dominate emerging and critical technologies, including AI systems. And the US sees this as a genuine strategic threat, both in terms of the economic value that AI can provide, but also the dual use capabilities of AI and what that means for military capacity as well. And so there's a range of processes is now put in place to deal with that. And this is still an early process, and it's very much an evolving and dynamic scene. I'm just listing a couple of them up there to give you the headlines. The first is investment in domestic AI capacity, strengthening the US innovation system, semiconductors, building out a federated cloud, improving access and the R&D innovation system, particularly in the public sector, and increasing access to talent, where that's been an issue globally. And if you look at the NSC AI report, you'll also see a very extensive discussion about the importance of the US military scaling up its capacity to use AI. Export controls of critical technologies, another process underway in the Department of Commerce, which applies not only to AI, but a whole range of critical technologies. Investment screening, which will increasingly reduce the capacity of investors globally, but certainly from China, to invest in US technology companies, including those in AI, where that is seen as sensitive or commercially sensitive. And finally, there's an increased emphasis on working with allies to coordinate on approaches around AI and critical technology. So as I said earlier, there was the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, the inaugural meeting in Pittsburgh a couple of weeks ago, where there were 10 working groups, including around semiconductors and AI and platforms and data governance. And so this is the beginning of a broad discussion with the EU on aligning on these sets of issues. The Quad, which is the US, Japan, Australia, and India has set up is a new sort of formalized entity. It's set up a discussion and a body on critical technology standards where there'll be a lot more coordination on that process. The G7 has started to regularly discuss the importance of technology and AI, including, as I mentioned most recently, at the G7 meeting in France. And through trade agreements, the US is increasingly leading on new provisions on AI. This includes on data flows, on no forced localization requirements, on no access to source code. And so through building out these norms in trade agreements, they are also seeking to develop the rules on what a competitive AI landscape should look like globally. If you're interested in learning more about this, please go to policyware.org and join one of the courses that will provide comprehensive, regular, interactive sessions on a whole range of digital issues, including AI. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope this presentation was helpful to you.
Wow, Joshua, thanks for your insights, and thank you all for watching.